Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Microsoft is well known for Windows, Office, .NET, Xbox, Zune, and a long list of other products and technologies. Less discussed, however, is a group at Microsoft that isn't necessarily focused on ship dates, packaging, or competing products. Instead, they think about how computers and technology can make life easier. The name of this group is Microsoft Research. It was in 1991 when Microsoft became one of the first software companies to create its own computer science research organization. Today's guest joined Microsoft Research with two colleagues in 1993 to form the Decision Theory and Adaptive Systems Group. Since then, he has been at the center of a variety of projects focused on machine intelligence and adaptation, and in the related tasks of information discovery, collection, and delivery. Hello, I'm Robert Hess, and I'll be your host today as we talk with Eric Horvitz, Research Area Manager. I hope you enjoy this chance to look at the technology and the person behind the code. Born in 1958, Eric didn't initially jump into computer science. In fact, his interest first led him to look into biophysics and neurobiology at Stanford before ending up shifting focus to computer science, which eventually led him to Microsoft. But technology did fascinate him even at an early age. In kindergarten, he dissected a flashlight in order to reverse engineer it. This sense of accomplishment led him to try a second project, building a robot. Efforts which unfortunately ended in failure. Today, Eric continues to seek new insights in machine learning and reasoning and interpreting patterns of information. Join me now as I welcome today's guest, Eric Horvitz. Eric. So, a robot, huh? How old were you then?
Well, this was first grade, and I became known by friends and family as some sort of a technical guru when I ran around with a battery and a wire and a light bulb showing them how you can do this as a kindergartner. And I said, okay, well, next project, I want to do a robot. And I had a toy robot that I had been given by my grandmother as a 3-year-old, and I was always rather concerned that this robot here had rather limited cognitive powers, didn't answer questions, didn't understand what was going on. It was just sort of a robot that could
Couldn't
walk
do your
around.
homework for you or anything like that?
You know, homework wasn't that big in those days. But in general, I pulled together a whole bunch of parts. I remember spending a few afternoons with housing of a peanut can, wires, springs. I had some motors from toys. And I said, I can crack this problem. I just got to think this through clearly to figure out how to make a robot that can actually do some thinking. And here I am quite a few years later, and I think we're still pushing on that question.
So I guess it's probably a good thing you didn't actually complete that project, because you'd have a job right now, right?
Yeah, there was no chance of that, of completing the project, I mean.
So I mean, early on, having that level of fascination over, robots and science, stuff like that, where did that come from?
I'm not exactly sure. I've always been rather curious about things, and I remember going through a phase where I was very curious about thinking. It's probably, I don't know if it's healthy or not for a 3 or 4-year-old to start worrying about these things, but thoughts intrigued me, and thoughts of self and other, thoughts of people in my family, for example, and I just was very optimistic that this could be explained by the same kind of mechanism that would explain that flashlight, putting things together, flows, relays, parts. And I guess I had some sort of a inborn optimism that this could be solved. We can gather some insights by producing something bigger out of parts.
So that is computer science to a certain extent, and understanding that sort of stuff works together. And yet you didn't immediately get into computer science. You went down more the physical sciences, the medical sciences paths.
Right. Well, so I was very interested in physics and in biology. Very interested in I had a growing interest through school in brain, how the nervous system functioned, probably harkening back to those early days.
And that's where your little essay that you wrote comes in?
Yeah, we actually, we're talking about things from childhood, and I dug up a 6th grade report that my mother had kept for a number of years on the study of bionics, and I find it interesting that it actually captures some of my early optimism here, even in my little report in 6th grade, where we talk about in bionics, scientists have done experiments on trying to duplicate animals' brains and also man's own brain. And I talked about a few years ago, scientists said here that you could build an electronic brain to match human brains, but it would require all the tubes and relays that would fit in the Empire State Building. It would require all the energy that the Niagara Falls gives us. And with all this, tubes, relays, and energy, the electronic brain would only operate for a fraction of a second before parts would have to be replaced. And then the prescient line here, transistors have changed the trouble with tubes. Good thought. So I think we're still, though, struggling on some of the basic concepts. And
yeah.
I think we don't know enough yet to know, for example, the size and scale and properties and functions that you would need to replicate something as mysterious to us today as human thinking and thought.
I mean, it's just part of the research, understanding the whole piece like that.
Yeah, and in fact, Microsoft Research in many ways, many teams have that kind of vision where we look out with vision. We consider the difficulty of problems, the doability of various kinds of tasks and challenges, and we think about timing. Like what's a 5-year target, 7, 10, 15-year kind of target. And what's nice is for many problems that we face, it's not all or nothing where you get to the 15-year mark and finally there's your prototype popping out ready to go to provide some value in the world. Along the way, you can actually do quite a bit, and designing the trajectory that's flexible and responsive to the early findings, so you can actually even fire those little jets to vector yourself in different directions on the way to a vision can be really an effective strategy.
Now, your academic training comes from Stanford mostly, correct?
Yeah, I did my undergraduate work at Harper College in Binghamton, and then went to Stanford with my eyes on an MD PhD in neurobiology, and that was my goal for the first year and a half at Stanford.
That's the direction you wanted to take your career into?
Yeah, absolutely. I was really passionate about neurobiology. I did some undergraduate research with a fabulous mentor, Robert Isaacson, who's a scientist of the limbic system. And I became, as he told me, one of his best microelectrode people. The idea is you take a very small piece of glass and you put it in a puller, and you pull a very fine electrode that you fill with a saline solution or other kinds of solutions, but the tip of that electrode is small enough to poke individual neurons with and to listen in. And I remember my first few experiences of listening into the neurons in rats as they were mostly asleep in different regions of the brain as part of per the studies we were doing in a darkened room with an oscilloscope tube showing me the action potentials as the single neuron was firing, that, something, even though I don't know what's going on in this mysterious black box that's very related to our own mind, no doubt, as we're both vertebrates, sharing the same central recent branch of the tree of life, that I'm in there with thinking somehow. Something about what I'm doing is I'm probing thought. And I went off to Stanford thinking, let's put the reductionist and emergence, try to understand cell assembly someday and go beyond. And as far as the evolution of where computing came in, reading those books that I mentioned earlier, Science of the Artificial, diving into some of von Neumann's work, looking at Turing's early paper on computability with Church that I really enjoyed. This was the time in the early 80s where personal computers were becoming quite popular. And I remember sitting in a lab, actually in my lab, where one might listen to neurons doing their clicking and clacking. And during my reflection about what the relevance of listening to neurons was, turning and looking at, I think it was an Apple II computer with the top off, sitting on a table right to the corner of the room. A friend of mine was tinkering with it, putting cards in of various kinds. And it just hit me that, what I was doing with such good intentions on the path, the biological path to understanding nervous systems and, you might say more broadly, cognition, was sort of akin to taking a little wire and putting it in that little black CPU on the motherboard and trying to infer the operating system of that computer, or even the application layer. And that probably wasn't going to get anywhere very quickly with understanding, for example, the functionality of the code, the intentions of the software designer.
So we now have you studying computer science rather than medical science. And how long did you do that at Stanford?
Yeah, so it's not necessarily rather than medical science. So I basically, in joint MD PhD programs, they can be various degrees of separation between them. But you often do a couple of years of what's called preclinical medical education, at which time you could take other kinds of classes, and I was doing computer science work and some psychology classes and so on. Then typically the medical students who are going off to do a PhD will take off some time and dive into their PhD work, finish that work, and come back to do the clinical years where you put your white coat on and get your clipboard, and you actually go through rotations in the hospital per different specialty areas of medicine. And so I dove off into changing my PhD out from neurobiology into the decision science space, and started actually thinking about really interesting applications in healthcare. So here I was socialized into the medical school class. The medical students get to know each other quite well. You work on, in your anatomy class, 4 per cadaver over a cadaver that you dissect, and it's a real bonding experience. So you really socialize into the medical school class, and you really, whether you intended to or not, become more and more passionate about healthcare. You know quite a bit more about healthcare. When I started getting into decision science, I got very interested in both decision-making under uncertainty, but also about what do we do with limited reasoners. If we built a limited system, how could it be optimized to do it the best it could? I had the sense that, and I still do very much, that we can understand a lot about intelligence, biological intelligence, human intelligence, if we push really hard on this notion of trying to do the best one can with limited computational resources, limited time, for example. That this would explain that the pressures of competition and minds would etch out brains with certain properties that did their best under constraints of various kinds.
Now this is about the same time where the buzzwords seem to be expert systems.
Yes.
Does this fall into the same model as expert systems, or is it a totally different path?
That's a really good question. So in the mid-'80s, there was an explosion of interest, both in academics and in industry, you may even say more so in industry, that we now had reached the era of intelligent machines. And there were quite a few interesting successes then. It was a time when theorem provers, essentially theorem proving systems that had been applied in abstract domains, mathematical theorem proving, were being filled with association knowledge or logical rules about the real world in domains like healthcare and machine diagnosis. And the theorem proving technology, typically known as rule-based, either chaining forward or chaining backward, or combinations thereof, was being demonstrated and showing a remarkable ability to actually solve problems in the world, to do diagnosis in medicine, for example, to diagnose bacteremias. This is the Meissen system authored by my third advisor, Ted Shortliff. And I and a couple of colleagues were actually situated, we found ourselves situated in a group that was sort of at the, you might say, at ground zero for this technology. I and others were looking at these methods, and we found some trouble with the ability to actually make them modular. People wanted these systems to be such that you could have a modular knowledge base that had modular rules in it, that you can sort of stick rules into or pull them out and not worry about all these dependencies.
So it's a medical technician one time and it's a plumber the next.
Yeah, but even for medicine, for example, you might want to add more and more rules to it, make it smarter and smarter as you learn more information. And there was a goal, and if you read some of the early writings in those days, one of the goals was these systems should be easy to maintain and extend from data or from human expertise. And there was and this is a little subtle, potentially for the audience, but there's an issue when you introduce a new fact, that in reality these facts can't be considered wholly atomic or modular from other facts.
They're not isolated in that one area. They
Right.
actually propagate throughout the entire tree.
Right, and they don't necessarily, they can't be integrated in necessarily in an easy manner, in a local manner. You may have to sort of do a complete global reanalysis of all the dependencies in the system. And this, we found, made these systems very fragile. Now, it wasn't our doing that there was a collapse of excitement. There was a sense that there was an overheating of the expectations for artificial intelligence in the mid-'80s. Because of that and other reasons, the systems didn't pan out. It was hard to build these systems, maintain them, have them be broadly applicable. I and other colleagues started looking at going beyond the theorem-proving approach, which was chains of logical inferences, if-then rules, into looking at what we call probabilistic systems, models of inference and probability that where you could have some modularity in dependencies and do proofs about how to add facts to a system and remove them and extend these systems. More generally, building systems that could actually take action under uncertainty, which seemed to be the real world. And I think this line of reasoning, which has been called UAI or uncertainty in AI, became mainstream artificial intelligence research. It in part ended up weaving together several separate disciplines. Computer science, decision science, statistics and probability theory came together. And all of a sudden, rather than in many ways reinventing the wheel and saying, here's a new way to reason, we were building upon hundreds of years of great human effort and intellect in these different disciplines that were coming together and being woven together. And now we're right in the middle of that. So now you go to an AI conference, and what you're seeing is the beautiful synthesis of work in many different fields coming together with an openness to really understanding previous work, as well as where the newer things that were considered new and separate, let's say in the mid-'80s, how they fit in.
Mm-hmm. And then all this is basically tying back to your first grade robot.
Well, I mean, it ties back to the interest in understanding human thought. And of course, I have a much healthier respect for the difficulties of building things like robots these days.
So then from Stanford, did you go straight to Microsoft, or did you have other businesses between?
While at Stanford, I did a couple things. I started a nonprofit foundation with a couple of friends in the early 80s called the Center for Innovative Diplomacy. And that group actually did quite a bit in like the early 80s on the Internet for the World. And we in fact, I and my two colleagues at CID were recently reflecting that if we were more interested in making money as a rather than being a nonprofit that was going to save the world during the early days of the Reagan administration, we could have built AOL with ease. We basically brought online, we set up networks of servers and brought email to different communities, to the foundation community, who are also funding us. That was very handy overlay of goals. We actually also, as part of CID, in a fun project, brought the first wide-scale internet to the Soviet Union at the time. It was called GlasNet, and it was really remarkable that we had servers in Palo Alto, California. We bought them online, and we brought the internet to the Soviet Union. This was kind of our nonprofit project. 3 of us, co-founders of the Center for Innovative Diplomacy, but we were exploring back then the idea of applying technology in ways to make the world a better place, to make it a freer place, to enhance communication. Now, maybe you might say I got wiser or just more passionate, but as I got into my PhD work later on, I joined up with David Heckerman, my colleague, and Jack Breeze a little bit after that. And we formed a for-profit company, and this was Knowledge Industries and KI. A little bit different than the nonprofit work. Maybe I was kind of empowered by the successes we had as a nonprofit to pull things off in the world on, you might say, a fairly large scale. I should say, by the way, on that GlasNet system, before I move on, when I say for large scale, remember that there was a coup back in the 90 or so, 91, and where all communications were shut down coming out of the Soviet Union. Maybe by then it was already Russia. I recall that the people were reporting that the only communications coming out were through GlasNet. And so they basically have this computer network actually beyond all the subtleties of how this might have affected the civilization there and the society and for openness and so on. The fact that the internet links were all up and running, and the only way people were getting information out during that time was a real, sort of, we felt like this was like, it really was an indication that this really was effective. It really had some impact. But moving on to the profit work in Knowledge Industries, I think there's nothing more exciting, though I don't recommend this to graduate students these days whose committees I sit on, but there's nothing more exciting than taking some really fun stuff that you're passionate about, that stuff you're working on as a doctoral student, especially if it's new, like we work in graphical models and Bayesian networks. And you realize you have stuff here that really does work. My gosh, we really have stuff that really can do inferences about healthcare and about machine failure. Let's do a startup.
What exactly did you do? You haven't really said what KI did.
Yeah, so KI was taking some technologies that we had been working on. David Heckman had been working on some knowledge acquisition technology. How do you capture and encode knowledge from experts? Several of us working on inference. So we actually created one of the first, you might call it, platforms, commercial platforms for capturing expert knowledge graphically with probabilistic knowledge under uncertainty, as well as runtimes. You can compile out models that would sort of look at the world, take in evidence, ask questions back, do a dialogue about what was wrong with the machine, for example, which tests to do next, and then come to a conclusion as to a diagnosis.
We're still talking expert systems, then, for the most part.
We're talking a new generation of expert systems that you might say is today's generation. That line of work has continued. And what's changed a lot between those days and now is that rather than requiring experts to sit and it's a wonderful experience to have a dialogue with an expert and have him working with tools and having an expert saying, wow, I really like seeing my thoughts on this screen. This causal knowledge is beautiful to look at and I can actually edit it. That's always nice, but these days we have quite a bit more prowess at taking raw data. Also, the data is more available now on a variety of fronts, whether it be search logs, behavioral data, or even jet engine logs, but taking data and actually building these networks, these predictive models directly from data. And in fact, some people have shown how you can actually take expert knowledge of the kind that Don Owens gave us, or that a trauma care surgeon gave me for trauma care, or the expert photocopy people gave me for photocopy, or the NASA people give us for the NASA space shuttle, but taking those models and actually combining it with data streaming in and building new models that capture both the expert knowledge and the raw data. to build expert systems that are quite good these days. And so we are seeing a rise now, and I always say it's like you feel it's like a palpable increase in our ability to have automated intelligence, machine intelligence. Not necessarily at the level of, cognizant, self-aware agents that I may have been pursuing in first grade, but you really sense we're creating with confidence now the building blocks you'll probably need to get there.
Mm-hmm. So do you separate the decision process from the thought process? Are the two the same?
That's a very good question. Just popping out of maybe talking about what I know a lot about into maybe cocktail conversation for a bit, human mind. It's not clear how much of our mind our conscious reflective processes take up versus subconscious processes, and whether or not at all these levels, subconscious up to conscious, we may have the same kinds of things going on, decision-making and actions, for example, inferences and actions under uncertainty. So at the foundations, agents that do well in the world because they know how to sense, they know how to take multiple observations and create inferences, do inferences about the various probabilities of things going on in the world, and then given those probabilities and some objectives, taking the best actions at any moment, that might be happening at many levels of human cognition. What people tend to refer to as decision making is the deliberate, reflective, explicit notion of, oh, I have a decision to make here, I'm going to reflect and take it in action. They don't usually think about how they approach or engage another person as a decision problem, or how they walk from one location to another, or decide how to drive someplace, or even in driving, steering and correcting a vehicle as decision making. But all these things might be viewed as decision making. And my sense is, to answer your question now crisply, is that there are likely decision processes at many levels in people, and we'll probably have to address that kind of thing in successful robots someday.
What was the decision process then that eventually brought you to Microsoft?
That's a big jump. Well, that's an interesting situation. So the story there was, here we were, three of us, and I just mentioned that this is my dear colleague David Heckerman and a dear friend Jack Breeze, who joined up with us. We were all PhD students together. David and I were actually MD PhD students together. And we were zooming along. We had our company. We were finishing up our dissertations. And having a blast. I remember I actually went back to medical school to finish my last bit of medical school, and there I was, the CEO of this, company that was on the upswing with projects and people and so on. I remember getting buzzed, paged, and having phone calls that I had to call back the senior VP at Northwest Airlines with my white jacket on, who had no idea I was finishing at medical school. I was running this company, and my PhD was now done, and I was on the phone talking about a maintenance problem and a contract next to this beeping cardiac machine. I thought, that's nothing. I'm a CEO of, yes, I'm still in charge of Knowledge Industries. But we were all in this world of doing many things when David Heckerman mentioned one day that a friend of his from high school, Nathan Myhrvold, had called him up and was getting interested in, had noticed some of his papers and was getting interested in uncertainty, and had got a sense for this new wave in what I call Bayesian expert systems, Bayesian referring to probabilistic inference that goes on in them. Wouldn't he and his colleagues might want to come up to talk to Microsoft? Well, we said, let's follow up on this. And so Jack, David, and I came up to Microsoft. our goal was we had a little sport coat. We were going to sell our wares to Microsoft, like we did for United Airlines.
Did you have a tie on?
Oh, I think we had a tie, a sport coat tie. The way we see most visitors at Microsoft showing up for their meetings here. Our reflection was that Microsoft was probably going to be interested, just like NASA or Ricoh Corporation, in making a deal with our group. And we wondered, okay, Windows 3.1 had just shipped, and they probably needed us for something or other. And so we went up to give a presentation, and we actually, I remember meeting the recruiter. It was actually Kevin Shields. He's actually, at the time he was in HR. Kevin's gone to do many things at Microsoft. And he handed us these packets. And I said, what are these? He goes, these are your employment packages. And we looked at each other and we said, no, you got the wrong idea. We're here to show you our company and tell you what we're up to and see how we can work with Microsoft. And he goes, no, you have the wrong idea. These are packages. We'd like you to come work for Microsoft. We looked at your stuff and we really like it, and this is Nathan's intention. This is Nathan Myhrvold. And I think we pushed back and forth a couple of times. And I think I even maybe have uttered the comment like, we'd be more likely to join Microsoft. We'd be more likely to join Maytag than Microsoft. Microsoft. And this was before we really had a sense for what Microsoft was going to come to be. More broadly, but more specifically, we had no real concept of the plans to build a major research organization at Microsoft. And so we spent a couple days here. I gave a presentation. I remember I spoke in Building 9 in the big conference room about all the things we were doing and the applications that might have someday to software. And Microsoft, along our best guesses as to what Microsoft might find interesting in this. I remember in particular I thought that we had just done some really fun work at NASA at the Mission Control Center, working with the propulsion section down in the lower right-hand side of that old Mission Control room, were people that looked at data streaming in, and we built a Bayesian system or a probabilistic system that would not only reason about the fault on the space shuttle in a very time-critical propulsion section of the shuttle, but would reason about what the human in front of the screen knew and needed to know, and would triage the information coming at the human being. So an ideal kind of human-computer interface solution with our methods, with several layers, not just a diagnostic layer, but also reasoning about, with a user model, as we call it, about what the person believed and expected, to really have this ideal connection between machine and human. And we sort of focused on that in part in our Microsoft presentation and in some of our discussions. We sat with Rick Rashid, we sat with Nathan, and we were convinced that Nathan was serious, that he was going to put together, even though there were maybe, 10 or 15 people here at MSR in Redmond at the time, some of whom were actually doing core research yet. They'd been acquired from other teams. But convinced us that there was going to be a major operation, and he really spoke to my heart when he said, and this stuff you're doing, this reasoning under uncertainty, it should be core in operating systems and applications. It's the future of computation. And this went back and forth for a while. We said no several times, and I remember when I finally broke down when Nathan, at one of our talks when I came up again, leaned forward to me and he said, Bill Gates is a Bayesian, and he wants you guys here, and he'll do we'll do whatever it takes. And think about it. He said, how many applications have you shipped? And I said, well, we got this thing at NASA, we have United Airlines, Ricoh Corporation. We're thinking about doing all this medical stuff now. We have 500 people using this pathology system. And he said, minimal ship 10 to the 6th at Microsoft. That seems funny nowadays, but he said, 1 million. Well, he said, think about what that means to your stuff. And I started thinking that Microsoft might give us this incredible lever with the fulcrum at the horizon to really take stuff we really believed in this technology as a way to enhance the world and give us the leverage to really get it into the world and to even at the same time promote basic science, basic research.
And did he follow through on that promise?
Microsoft Research has grown to become even more than what I expected it to become at the time. And we were pretty optimistic. Under the lead of Rick Rashid and others, and maybe we can even say with help of some of the early folks there like myself, it's become this gem among research labs, well known for bringing in only the best and the brightest, for creating a beautifully open environment, having an unprecedented publication model that's open, where the researchers themselves make decisions about how they want to engage, for example, on IP, intellectual property with patent attorneys before publishing, educating the researchers to make those decisions rather than having a tower of attorneys, for example, that oversee, or committees that oversee when and the timing of publications. The academic freedom and the excellence and the concentration of the best and the brightest folks across a diversity of computer science specialty areas, and now not just at Redmond but at 5 other centers, has made the labs just an outstanding and unique community.
So what are some of the things you personally have been able to deliver here at Microsoft?
Well, just starting from the most recent that I'm still buzzing about. We buzz about things that we can ship. Is ClearFlow. So ClearFlow is, I call it one of our Manhattan projects. I think I once mentioned that to our PR folks, and they said, call it Moon Mission. I said, okay, one of our Moon missions. And the idea was, to see if we could, through machine learning, the building of predictive models from large amounts of data, could we predict the road speeds by time of day and day of week and a whole bunch of other factors, weather, traffic reports, and so on, even Mariner games starting and ending, and Husky games on the weekends. Could we predict all the road velocities on side streets? So we fielded internally for a year. We had people at Live Maps monitoring it and playing with it as well. We were confident in it enough that we can really do something quite innovative for the traffic industry. Never been done before, to have a whole city context-sensitive traffic system that could route cars based on inferences. And the idea that right now, as we sit here, right, so at this moment, there are 72 North American cities for which ClearFlow is available on maps.live.com. You hit the little ClearFlow button. It's actually even called ClearFlow in the product. They used our code name. They liked it so much, the marketing folks, and, to know that every few minutes we have systems that are updating the road speeds on every single surface street in 72 cities, and then letting people route with these inferences. To me, this is like a big buzz. It's like, okay, there's an El Dorado turning left in Buffalo right now, and instead of turning right, and that might help this person out get to their place more quickly based on this inference. Our team. Yeah. We have a great team of folks.
Matter of fact, I actually used it the first time myself. I needed to get to downtown Seattle, and traffic just was a mess. And so I said, well, I need to get from Microsoft downtown Seattle. The main street was like 35 minutes. Well, let's just click this ClearFlow, see what happens. ClearFlow said 29 minutes if I took their path, and it took exactly 29 minutes to get downtown Seattle from Microsoft, even with bad traffic. It took me off the main streets, and I got there, and it was wonderful. Some of the future stuff, I understand you're doing something with an automated receptionist or something like that. What exactly is that?
Oh, here it is. No, okay. I'm just teasing. So we have a project that's being led by Dan Bohush on our team. He's a new researcher who joined us from CMU, but we're building a bigger team around him on this, and I collaborate very closely with him as well, called Situated Interaction. And the idea is part of this long-term dream of building systems that can do inferences about the pace of conversation, that can engage people in a dialogue with a machine. an automated receptionist, and so on. So one of the projects in this space we called the receptionist. The idea was to look at the task that Microsoft building receptionists have. It was hard enough to be almost undoable, but well-defined enough to give us a glimmer of hope that we might actually learn something by trying to build an automated variant of that receptionist, understanding his or her tasks, understanding how to engage people, what their attention is at any moment, how to deal with multiple parties waiting for service, how to optimize the flow of a group, how to understand conversation, even overhear it at times, how to use gaze to communicate to people who is being addressed, understanding the social cues that might go on in a fluid conversation. And that's basically, we call it the receptionist project.
I understand. We've actually got a video of it in action so that people can kind of see what this means to have an automated receptionist working for them, maybe in sometime in the near future. Let's take a look.
The receptionist project is a specific instantiation of this long-term vision that we're pursuing. The parts that we're looking at have to do with how do you manage conversation, engagement, attention, floor, and grounding. So how do you relate all these different concepts and create a system that's able to engage in an interaction that's free-flowing, and follows the natural pace of human conversation.
Hi. My name is Laura, and today I'm here to help the receptionist with shuttle reservations. What's your name?
I'm Dan, and this is Eric.
Nice to meet you. Do you need a shuttle?
So what you'll see noticing is that the system is able to detect multiple participants in the scene. It's able to track their poses. Here it knows I'm oriented towards the system and Eric is oriented towards me. It's composing that with information from the microphone array, which tells us the direction that speech is coming from at any given moment. And with an analysis of the torsos of the different actors, basically of the clothing that we're wearing. And based on that, we infer a number of variables about the actor. Then we go one level up in this analysis and gather information about the tasks that are active here. So the system analyzes the relationships between the different actors and infers that here, most likely, Eric and I are in a group together, and we're engaging as an active task to the system, and our current goal is to get a shuttle. We believe that it's a very good platform for doing that kind of work.
Which building are you going to?
I forget, where are we going?
I think it's building 9.
You sure?
Yes.
So, you're going to 9, right?
Yes.
And this is for both of you, right?
Yes.
I'm making a shuttle reservation for building 9 for
so
2
who has the
people.
slides?
In
Paul
case
has
you
the
want to
slides, not
correct
worry.
anything,
I think he's
say
getting
or
it
press
early,
star
actually.
over.
So,
Are you visiting someone?
Okay,
Yes.
So I think
I'll
everything should
help
be
you
all set
register
then.
in just a moment.
fabulous.
I think it's a great video. I think it really illustrates some of the hard problems we might just take for granted when you're dealing with casual conversations like that.
Exactly. One of the interesting aspects of doing research in artificial intelligence, especially when you're getting to the goal of building systems that can work with people and interact and have dialogue and sense intention and address goals, is that so much of what people do so easily, it's almost magically invisible to us, needs to be teased out, brought to the surface, and addressed with explicit machinery. It's interesting. We often discover these things when we fail dramatically. We'll try the first version of Receptionist and realize, oh my God, we need to really understand when people are talking to each other versus the machine. We need to understand when what they're saying and the system's overhearing might be relevant to the current question or task at hand.
Or irrelevant to it.
Or non-relevant, which might be most of the time. We have to understand, and it turns out it's not so easy for a machine to recognize when 2 people among a crowd or 3 are part of the same task or same group. I just need one shuttle. It's obvious to a human being that these people are together. There's so much that goes on subconsciously and with fluidity and with ease that even researchers pushing on the hard problems don't get to make those things explicit. They don't come to life until you fail, and you realize, oh my God, we have to even do that part. Wow, that's an interesting area of research. Now let's push on that a little bit. So, I mean, little things even. In that video just now, you probably didn't see what was going on because you can't really, in a fast-paced video, especially if on NTSC, you can't really see some of those annotations going on in that conversational scene analysis. But we're even reasoning about not just the likely goals of each person in the group, but there's a line between people when the system thinks they're likely in a group with a certain confidence. There's a little reflection about the dress wear. It noticed that Dan and I were dressed casually, and Ziqing in the back was dressed formally. It said formal dress wear. That's why the agent looked up and said, and directed the gaze, which was a real red dot in the system, directed her gaze at the person waiting in the back, in this case Ziqing, working with us on the project, and said, are you visiting somebody? That kind of thing would happen with fluidity.
He's wearing a tie, like
it wasn't a necktie, but he had a sport coat and a nice little white shirt, and the likelihood of him being a Microsoft employee is way down there, 10 to the minus I don't know what. So the system actually knew that and made those inferences. And these subtleties are what we expect from people all the time, and they are kind of provide a delightful array of challenges that you didn't expect at the outset of the project when you try to build a system like this.
For me, one of the exciting things talking with you about what you used to do, what you're doing now, and what you're planning on doing, is the fact that there really is a solid thread throughout your entire life that is tying everything together, that you clearly enjoy doing what you're doing today and what you're going to be doing in the future. I suppose one way to really find out how well these things fit together is, what do you do outside of work? I mean, you clearly aren't working at Microsoft all the time. You have an outside life.
I do. It's really funny because one of my friends who actually I did my PhD work, he's another PhD at Stanford, I noticed that we would be hanging out at Tahoe or something, and I'd be talking, and he'd say, Eric, that's work. We're off now. I said, I never thought these things were separate. Isn't this is the most exciting stuff we can be talking about, whether we're in a cabin in the hills or not. So maybe I do take it very personally and seriously that like understanding, for example, the computational foundations of mind is almost a religion. It's pervasive, but I do other things. And so I enjoy going out and rollerblading. I love working with outside organizations. So like many other people at Microsoft Research, we have outside efforts in the academic community. People sit on program committees, editorial boards, as I do. One of my major outside activities right now is that I'm serving as president of the Association for the Advancement of AI, the AAAI as it's called. It's probably the largest membership group in the world of AI researchers and practitioners. And it's been a lot of fun to take the helm of a large organization which has been around since 1979 and work on where that sits today as it engages not just the academic community but society as a whole.
But it's hard to imagine an artificial intelligence group started in 1979. They were just still doing wire wrap boards back then, weren't they?
Right. They were removing the last of the vacuum tubes and going to these 16 transistor radio versions of things.
So what does this group do, though?
So the AAAI is a large membership group that promotes research in this area. It runs a major conference and some smaller conferences every year. One of the major national conferences on AI. Now we broadened it to it's just the international conference every year. It does student scholarships. It publishes a magazine. It does education work. It gives out awards. It recognizes fellows in the society, people who have made certain achievements get a distinction. Works with government at times. People might find interesting that one thing that I'm doing this year as president is I established what's called the presidential panel. And the idea is that the president can call into being a panel and focus it on a topic. So this panel that I'm doing is called, as the first panel, the AAAI Presidential Panel on Long-Term AI Futures. There's a lot of rumbling these days from people like Ray Kurzweil and others that we're approaching a singularity, that things might change quickly, that we have movies like Terminator, robots getting out of hand, Skynet and so on. And so what this panel is doing is we brought together a fabulous group of experts from around the world, the best people in their field, to look at challenges with potential disruptive influences of AI, good and bad, on society, long-term concerns about AI getting out of control. For example, might we do proactive things if that was really a concern to make that less of a concern, and even ethical issues coming online as we get things like more competent robots in the world. We're having a meeting at Asimov coming up in February, akin to the meeting that the people in recombinant DNA had several decades ago, when there were concerns about what might go wrong with the results of recombinant DNA experiments and efforts. And so the idea is to have this group get together and actually publish a report that goes a little bit beyond maybe the lay press and says, listen, here's an expert panel and here's what we think about the concerns versus the opportunities and challenges ahead. Mm-hmm. So that's going to be a lot of fun.
No, but isn't that something that Isaac Asimov already solved with the 3 laws of robotics? I mean,
well, it turns out that Isaac Asimov was prescient in some of the things he was reflecting about, and if you got online and looked at some of the discussions we're having right now with this committee, some of those basic laws of robotics, for example, are coming up now. But from the point of view of the experts working on this panel, you can actually formalize those things in beautiful ways mathematically and extend them to create biases and constraints on agents, for example, computational agents, to make sure that there's no risk of things getting out of hand. Mm-hmm.
Like sometimes we see in science fiction movies happening all the time.
I think most movies that characterize something about AI go off the deep end in terms of the fear, which probably sells a lot of movie tickets.
Yeah. Well, we hope you enjoyed that little discussion with Eric. We now come to the part of the show where we have a few specific questions we always ask all of our guests, just so you can kind of find a little bit more behind them. So Eric, the first question we want to ask you is, what sort of advice do you have for people in your field?
I like to often talk about boundaries and bridges. Really hard problems don't necessarily respect the borders that we impose with our disciplines. Computer science, decision science, biology. Hard problems, just look at these and scoff, these borders. So I basically tell people to blur them, build bridges, think about the problem directly, but know many things about the world from all of our sciences, all of our philosophy and thinking to address the problem head on. Many sparks of creativity come by breaking down the borders to do fundamental interdisciplinary research. On another boundary, I like to tell people to push to the edge of tractability, to the edge of doability. Try it, go for it, go a little bit harder, broader, and deeper. Even failure, you can learn quite a bit from, and success sometimes comes magically in ways you didn't expect. And finally, while it's great to have insights and inspiration and come to ahas alone, finding great collaborators is as important as finding great problems to work on.
Pretty good. I mean, it's just been basically understanding what the problem set is and pushing yourself and pushing the problem forward as well.
Smearing over those boundaries.
Yeah. So the next question is, how do you explain what you do to someone who's not technical?
I often say that I'm trying to enhance computers such that they can do things that you'd expect you'd need people to do. To make computers better at learning and thinking, and to make them more valuable in the world beyond just little appliances we might be playing with on a desktop, to bring them into the world.
Mm-hmm. Then in life, what would you compare to producing software?
Well, these software, as you know, we're in an incredible time where we have these tools now, and software and compilers. It's like this beautiful open canvas to do painting on and to bring creation into the world that's only limited by our minds. It's a tool that provides both the blueprints and the structure to build beautiful architectures that soar into the sky.
Mm-hmm. Now, I suppose, for all of our guests, this is probably a question that fits more home to you because what you're doing is so much like life to a certain extent. It's just like thinking and thought. And so it flows very well from that. Now, the next question, which I think you might have some fun with, is finish this sentence. You know you're a computer nerd when?
When you have dreams about simulation modeling that you learn from and wake up thinking of a great class. I actually mentioned this question to my wife just before we went to bed last night, and her reaction was, well, wait a minute, how about our first dinner date, the third chair was a laptop you were showing me software on. And that's a sign that you're a nerd, or the fact that she can't get rid of my 128K Mac in the garage. I just want to hold on to that Macintosh.
I mean, sometimes it might be a prop, just like your robot's a prop on stage like this. Now, the final question that our audience always enjoys is stressing some of your creative talents in a different direction. And that is, I want you to draw a picture of your favorite data diagram, explain it, and make sure you sign it as well.
Well, I have to say that a very interesting data structure that's come out of our field in the last 20 years is called the directed acyclic graph, and these are beautiful in that you can often do graph reversals on these. They capture probability distributions, conditional probabilities among variables you care about, observations, for example, and hypotheses, and they even allow you to reason about, at times, variables you have never observed before. Hidden variables to do foundational science work. Directed acyclic graphs.
So go ahead and sign that. Very good. And now we can open this up to questions from the audience. Does anybody in the audience have a question? Yes, over here.
So you mentioned earlier in your advice section that to not be afraid of failure because sometimes you really learn a lot from it. I was just wondering, maybe at one point in your career, maybe where you encountered that and what you ended up learning.
Many times. I think I'll say that my first PhD thesis topic ended with my decision that it was too hard, and I changed topics. I was going to build a system that could do scientific theory confirmation, to reason about the validity of different scientific theories. I tried really hard to make that system work, interviewing particle physicists and biologists, and I decided it was too hard, but I learned a lot about value of information, which is a construct I use in other things now. I decided that would be a long-term mission that I'm on now, to have systems that help scientists do their work as research collaborators of sorts. I learned about the kind of frustration with stopping everything and retooling. Do you want to hear about my house remodeling experience? It's very similar.
Thanks. Do we have another question from the audience? Yes, over there.
Yeah, so Eric, I was very fascinated about your similarities that you draw between a human mind and a computer. So I was thinking, have you thought about what role does emotions and irrationality play in human lives? Can that sort of, can project it onto a machine? And are those things important in terms of computation, and how would that benefit?
It's a really interesting question. I think that computational foundations of mind is orthogonal to the kinds of behaviors that people express and the way they feel at times. I am interested in that dimension in two ways. One is in making systems that, if they work with people, understand human emotion, so they can better coordinate and collaborate and so on. But more fundamentally, emotion must be there for a reason. And to understand the information theoretic foundations of sadness, arrogance, humility, confidence, I think will be very illuminating in a theoretical way.
Thank you, Eric, from the Technical Community Network, for being our guest today. And thanks to all of you in the audience for coming.